What is React context and which problems does it help you solve? That is precisely what this video is about. I'm gonna give you a concept overview of when to use React context and how to use it for maximum benefit and best possible code maintainability. Let's get into how you can leverage context for your React application. Okay, grab your coffee and let's get into how React context works. So what I've drawn here is a React component, and this is how your typical React project looks like. I'm gonna draw it here on the right side. So you have one root component that everything else originates from, and that is standard in React and also works the same way in every other application. I'm just gonna draw an R in here so you know this is the root component. And then from this root component, all other React components originate. It doesn't matter what these are and which components these render in turn. So for example, this could be a dashboard component, and this dashboard component renders a separate button component, and it also renders a contact form component, for example. Now, this is super important to understand the concept of context, because suppose you wanted to pass something from the dashboard to a component that lives inside this contact form, which could be, for example, the submit button, right? Let's just assume that is a separate component. So this would be the contact form and this would be the submit button, and the rest don't really matter. So suppose you wanted to pass some props from this dashboard right here to this component right here. The normal approach you would take in React is the following, and let me change the stroke for that. So the normal approach is you get the props in this component right here, and then you pass them down to the contact form component right here, and then this contact form component right here passes them down, and I don't know why I did that, but it passes them down to this button right here, so this button receives the props in the end. What we're doing right here is called prop drilling. It means passing props through components just so another component can get them, because this contact form component here does not need the props, but rather it just acts as a throughput to forward the props to this submit button component here. So passing the props in here is actually totally unnecessary, and we don't need to do that. And that is a problem that React context solves, and let us take a look at how it does that. So let me enable these right here, and we see when we're working with React context, we are differentiating between two different things. That is a context provider and also a context consumer. And this is very interesting because this context allows us to do something really interesting. We can define a context provider in here. Remember this color right here, it's the context provider. So that means we are providing something called context. Now what exactly that is, I'm gonna get into in a second, but we are providing context in this component right here. And what this means is that every component that is lower in the component tree, so every component that this also renders now has access to whatever context we provide right here in the above component. And context is a fancy term that can mean anything. It can mean any value that you declare as a constant or functions or whatever you want to pass on to children components, and we just call that context. So for example, the const theme color is equal to light, right? We could keep that as state in a component, but we want all components to know what the current theme color is, right? And for that, we can define this value inside of the provider and then pass that to all children. And the interesting thing about context is that it's according to an opt-in principle. We can get this value wherever we want, but we don't get it by default. And that's what these context consumers here are for. So for instance, we want the value of the color theme in this submit button component right here, and we do not need to pass it through this component. That is the main advantage of context. All components that are lower than this component in the component tree can opt in to the context and thereby receiving the value. So in this component, we can say const, and then we can say theme color is gonna be equal to use context of whatever we call this context. So let's say just context. I think you get the idea, right? So whatever values we provide right here, or functions, or whatever you want to provide to all children of the context provider, we can opt in every component that we want, but we don't have to. And therefore, we avoid having to pass props through components just to forward them to another component. Now, one more thing, the context is not defined in the provider. That was just for illustrational purposes. In actuality, the context is provided outside of the React tree. So you can imagine this as being just a separate file that lives over here, outside of the normal React tree that we have right here. So in here, we can declare the context as whatever we want. For example, say the const theme color is going to be equal to light, and then we also want all children to have access to a function that lets us change this color. So we would probably also want to put that in context. So const change theme color is going to be, I'm just going to mock this, but you can think of it as a function that we also pass to all children. And we define that in a separate file that lives out here. And then in the provider, we mention that file and provide the context to all children. Now, I hope the principle is clear, and let's get into how this looks in practice in a React project. Okay, so here we are inside of a React project. Now this uses TypeScript, but I'm gonna make sure you can follow along just fine in regular JavaScript as well. So this is gonna be totally beginner friendly. Now this main.tsx would be the equivalent of the root component that we had right here, where everything else, all other components in the whole application originate from. This is where it all converges. And inside of the main.tsx, the only thing that we're doing is rendering this app component right here. Now, inside of the app components, it looks very bare bones right now, but we can define our context provider first, and then inside of there, all the other components that should be able to receive this value. Now, the first step to creating our context is not going to be in the app itself, so that would be equivalent of this component right here. But we are going to define the context, as I said earlier, outside of the React project. And how that's normally done is it really comes down to preference how you do this. I normally make a folder, and we can do this together, that is called context. And then here we can define the context that we want. Let's call this theme context.tsx. Now again, this is going to be TypeScript, but I'm going to make sure you can follow along in JavaScript just fine. And the first step to defining our context is thinking about what value we want to provide to all children that we can then opt into. And in our case, first, that's going to be the theme color. And then later on, we're going to expand it with a change theme color. But for now, it's simply just going to be a constant. To syntactically define the context, we can say const and then theme context, because that's going to be the name of a context, is going to be equal to create context, which is something we get from React itself. And then in the create context, we can pass something called a default value. And this default value will be used when there is no provider. So that means if you forget to provide the context, but still decide to opt in, that won't work. And thereby the value inside of the opted in component that is not being provided anywhere in the whole document tree will fall back to this default value we define right now. And often case that could be null, or we could also define that as something that makes more sense in our context. So something like light or dark mode that we want to have by default. If you're working in JavaScript, that would be the extent of what we could do right here. And then we could just export that. Now, if you're following along in TypeScript, there is one option we can use to make this a bit easier. We can define an interface or a type for this context specifically. So we could call this theme context type, and initialize that as, we could say theme value, and that could be equal to light, or it could be equal to dark. Now this is a TypeScript specific syntax, essentially meaning that this theme value right here could take either one of these values, and we can pass that in here as a generic theme context type. And what that will do for us is first it will highlight, and yeah, I'm not going to zoom out, but rather close this, is first highlight this as wrong. And the reason being that we are passing an object here with a theme value property, and then here we are just passing one string. So we can initialize this as an object, press Ctrl spacebar to get the values of this type right here, and then pass a theme value as either dark or light. And that is the reason we're using this generic in TypeScript right here. So we get some type safety regarding this value right here that we've defined up here. But if you're following along in JavaScript, you could just leave this out. It just adds a bit of, more maintainability and safety to your app. And now that is all we need to do to create our context. Now this step outside of the component tree that we could have seen here on the right side is done. That is the file we've just created. And now the next step would be to provide this context to all the children in the document tree that we want to opt in to this context later, so that the children know what the current theme value is. And the way we provide this theme context is through a provider. And let's do this in the app. So literally all components in the entire app will later have access to this theme context. Now, because we are exporting this theme context, in here we can say theme context and then dot, and we can see there are 3 properties we could pass. First, we've got the consumer. So that means everything that consumes this context, or in simple terms, that knows or gets the value of this context. Then secondly, the provider, what we've already talked about, that provides the value, and then the display name, which doesn't really matter to us. In our case, we want the provider, and this provider takes multiple properties: a key that literally all React components can take, the children that we don't pass explicitly but rather implicitly, you'll see that in a second, and then also a value, and we can close that off with the theme context provider. And then in here we can pass the whole app, so everything that's left. So let's say, for example, a button component, and that button says do something. Now there's still an error here because this value is undefined. So you can see right here the theme value, we need to pass that into the provider, so the provider knows what value to propagate to the children, right? If this button right here subscribes to the context, then it needs to know what the value of theme value is, and we define that right here. So let's say we can keep that in a state, right? We can say theme value and set theme value that is going to be equal to either light or dark. If you're following along in TypeScript, if you're in JavaScript, you can leave that out. And then by default, we already defined this is going to be light. Now we still need to import useState, and we will be good to go. Now in here, we can say that the button should do something on click, and that is change the theme value. And let's say in here, we're going to set theme value and receive whatever it was previously as the first argument. And then if the previous was equal to dark, we're going to set the current value to light. And if it wasn't dark, so if it was light, we're going to change it to dark. So what we just did was create a toggle. So every time we click this button, the theme value gets toggled. So we can call this toggle theme value, and we're good to go. Let's start this up and take a look at what this looks like in the browser, and let's see what happens. So the button is kind of off, but it's not about the styling anyways. We can say toggle theme value, and right now nothing happens, but we can also just show the current theme value right here. So we can say theme value, so we can check if it actually works. So right now it's light, now it's dark. Every time I click the button, it toggles. And all components in the entire component tree that are below this context provider could subscribe to that. So for example, let's render a component. I think I called this page content. Let's say page content lives in this component as well. So it is being provided to by the theme context provider. If we go into this, this component is kind of a mess. So let's just initialize this as an empty div, remove everything that is already here. And now the question becomes, how do we opt in to the component tree, right? So we've done the provider step. Now anywhere in the document, we can opt in to get the current value of the context. How do we do that? And for that, we use this syntax I've outlined right here inside of the component. So we can say, any value that we can worry about the structuring later is going to be equal to use context. That is a hook that we get from React internally that we don't need to do anything for. And inside of this use context, we can pass this theme context that we have created outside of the React tree. We can pass that in here and also need to import that. And now, as you can see, we can get the theme value. And the reason we can destructure this theme value is because we put it in an object right here. If we just had the theme value as light, as we had initially, and I'm going to remove this type, then you could see that we couldn't destructure anything, but the theme value would be the top level value that we get as a string. So that would be this light right here. But I much prefer the object because then you always know exactly what you get inside of the context consumers. And now this component would always know what the current theme value is that we define outside of the component. So in the div, we could say a class name, and we can render out some conditional class names with Tailwind. So we could say if the theme value is, and that needs to go into template strings, like that. If the theme value is light, and that shouldn't be a question mark, that should be a triple equal, then we're gonna say that this div should have a background of white, and else we're gonna say it will have a background of black. And let's just say page content, it's not the context. And then we should be able to see that the page content is also being rendered on the page with a dark background because the current theme value is dark. If I click this button, it changes to light, and obviously we would also need to change the color of the text, but the background changes to white because this component has opted in to always know what the current theme value is. Now, one interesting caveat with context is that you can provide it multiple times and for different values. So we could say theme context.provider again, and this time we could provide a value of theme value, but that is always gonna be, for example, light, right? And we can close that off with theme context.provider, pass that in here, and that shouldn't be a triple equal, but a I think it's called a colon right here. So we are overriding the value just for this page content, but this button still gets the actual value. So this page content right here, the just the div we've defined, will always think that the theme value is what we overrode it with. So even if I click this button right here, the page content below will always think that we're still in light mode. Now you might wonder, Josh, that's cool and all, but I want to change the context from the children. Right now, we only change the context from the parent component, but that's not very useful if we want to define the context somewhere, then use it in other places, but also be able to change it from the children. And this use state we have right here just wouldn't suffice. So we can get rid of the use state, and let's take a look at how we would do that. And we can do that in the theme context file that we've already created, and by defining a custom component in here. And we can call this anything we want. However, it makes sense to call this theme context provider because that's what it's gonna be, and define that as a regular functional React component. If you're in TypeScript, you can also use the FC that you get from React, just meaning functional component, and this cannot return nothing. So we need to return something, and that is gonna be the theme context that we've defined up here. And from that, the provider, just like we've done in the app component, and also close that. Now this demands a value of theme value, which does not exist yet. So we are going to create that value as React state. We can do that by saying const theme value and also set theme value by convention. We call this set theme value is going to be equal to use state. Now this use state is going to take an initial state that we can define ourselves. And we can do that by destructuring some props that we get in. Now these props that we're going to receive are going to be the children, because we're going to wrap this, and then the children is whatever is inside of the provider, and they're going to be passed automatically. And then also we want the initial state of this component, and that should be, whatever you want. By default, we can say this is going to be light. Now, if you're in TypeScript, that will kind of be mad at you. And the reason is we also need to define the type of this. So interface props, so whatever props this component right here receives that we can pass to the FC are going to be the children of type React node, like that. We still need to import that from React, and then the initial, that is going to be optional, that we can pass in but don't have to. We're just going to be light or dark by default. But these parts right here, they are only valid if you're working in TypeScript. If you're in JavaScript, you don't need them. This is going to work just fine. However, this just makes the typing a bit easier. Okay, now the children we're going to render out in here like that. So everything that we pass into this provider, so the whole component tree that is still left below this provider is going to be passed as the children right here. And therefore we render them in the provider because we don't want to omit them, right? And what this structure allows us to do is copy this set theme value and pass it right here as the value that we can then subscribe to and use from the children components. That is the beauty of this architecture. Now again, JavaScript wouldn't yell at you, but we want TypeScript to yell at us if you're following along in TypeScript. So we also need to define the value or the type of the setTheme value, which is gonna be dispatch set state action. And the action that we're gonna dispatch is either a light value or a dark value like that. Close that off and also import those types from React. And then we need to define a default for that. And we can just define this as an empty function that returns void or nothing. So again, the values we define in here is whatever is going to be fallen back to when we forget to do the provider. So if we left this part out and still subscribed to the context in the child component, so the page content, it wouldn't do much, but it wouldn't throw an error at least by falling back to these values right here. But the actual values are going to be defined right here in our theme context provider. Now that we've defined that, we can get rid of the original theme context dot provider and render this theme context provider that we have just defined. Now this does not even need any arguments. We could pass it the initial if we wanted to, but because we made this optional right here and defaulted to light mode, we're gonna not depend on that to be passed from the parent component. We can get rid of all the unused exports with Shift, Alt, and O, save the app, and now we should be good to go. And inside of the page content, we can also define or change the context. First, let's see if this still works. So the server should still be running, and yes, it is. We can refresh this page and it thinks we are in light mode. And if we wanted to change that from this component, nothing easier than that. We can get the set theme value also destructured from the context that we can do because we defined it right here, and then also pass it as the value. So inside of these values go everything that we can subscribe to from the children components that we want to use. That's why we can get this here. And now let's create a button below the page content. And we're gonna need to wrap this in some fragments because we can always just pass one child. And this button is gonna be of type button just for some accessibility. And we're gonna say change website theme, and then on click we're gonna say set theme value. Jesus Christ, set theme value. We're gonna receive whatever it was previously as the first argument, and that is gonna be either light or dark mode. And then we're gonna initialize the same toggle that we had before. So if the previous is equal to a light, then we're gonna set this to dark, and that shouldn't go in template strings. That should be a question mark. So then we're gonna set it to dark, and else we're gonna set it to light. So to the opposite of whatever it currently is. And now if we go back to the button and click change website theme, we can change the context from the child component. Great, that is exactly what we wanted to do. And we could do this in any component that is below the context provider. Now, one last thing, one little caveat when working with context is we cannot subscribe to the context in the component that is rendering the provider. So syntactically, we could try to do this. We could say use context and then theme context, pass it in here, and try to destructure the theme value from here. And let's just render it out in a div, just say theme value. However, this will not work because the provider needs to be wrapping every component that also subscribes to this context that we're doing right here with the use context. That is the subscription of the component. So if I were to refresh the page, we wouldn't get an error, but you can see it does not change whenever we click the button. And that is what I mentioned the fallback values are for. So it keeps showing light no matter which theme we actually have, because that is what we defined as the fallback value up here. So if I change this to hello world, for example, TypeScript, probably wouldn't let me do that. But if we also type this at hello world, that would be fine. We can go back and it would be the default value. No matter how often I click the button, it would always just have the fallback value. And that is the beauty of React context. Now in every child, we can subscribe to this context, change it however we want, and utilize it throughout the application without having to resort to prop drilling. If you've gotten to this point of the video, I really hope you got a lot of value from it and learned how to properly use React context and when to use it. Now, if you want to learn how to write clean and reusable React components, this is the video showing you how to do it. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you there, and until then, have a good one and bye bye.